Hey, what's going on, everyone? Hope you're doing good today because I've got something pretty exciting to talk about. And if you're into Crusader Kings 3, you're really going to want to hang out for this. Paradox just pushed out the 1.117.1 patch, and while on the surface, it might not sound like the biggest overhaul in the world, there are actually a ton of little tweaks, bug fixes, and balancing changes that add up to a much smoother experience. What I want to do here is walk you through everything that's changed, but I don't just want to read off a list of patch notes at you. Instead, I'm going to chat about what these changes actually mean, why they matter, and how they'll affect your campaigns. Think of this as sitting down with a friend who also plays the game way too much and is just excited to unpack what Paradox has done with this update. So right off the bat, let's talk about one of the big categories of fixes, coronations. If you've been playing around with the coronation mechanics, you've probably noticed that sometimes guests acted really strange. There was this particular thing where a guest could get this event where they stopped to admire the venue during your coronation, which felt a bit off in terms of timing. That's been patched, so now guests act more like you'd expect them to. And while it might not seem huge, it's all about immersion. When you're trying to roleplay a ruler and have this big, solemn ceremony, the last thing you want is some clunky little text box pulling you out of the moment. It's small quality of life, but it adds up. Another funny one that's been fixed is when coronation hosts would sometimes mention unrelated realms during the oath swearing events. So you'd be the king of, say, England, and in the middle of your coronation ceremony, someone starts talking about realms across the continent that had nothing to do with you. That's fixed. And again, it makes everything feel cleaner. Paradox has been working on ironing out those weird little moments that pull you out of the role play and make you go, wait, what? That's a big part of why I like updates like this, because they might not scream new features, but they smooth the experience and keep it grounded. Now let's talk about decisions like Champion of the X culture. Previously, the requirements for this weren't always displaying correctly, which was just frustrating. You'd think you met the requirements, only to find out something was hidden or misrepresented. That's been fixed, so now you know exactly what you need. No more guessing games. And while we're on decisions and oaths, there's also a fix for the Consolidate the Empire oath. Before, it was checking your current primary title, which could cause some issues if you were holding multiple titles or had switched things around. Now it properly checks the specific title that the coronation was held for, which makes a lot more sense and avoids some odd inconsistencies. One of the most annoying bugs I ran into personally was with the Repent oath. It required you to go on pilgrimages, but the way it was counting them was completely broken. One pilgrimage could count as many or not at all, depending on how the game decided to behave. That's fixed, so if you're a religious ruler trying to make good on that promise, it actually works properly now. And speaking of oaths, the Purge Pretenders one has also been fixed in terms of requirements and tooltips. So now when you're taking on that challenge, you'll know exactly what's expected. Let's talk balance for a second, because there are a couple of interesting shifts here. For example, some oath requirements that previously locked you into having specific buildings are now more flexible. Instead of saying, you must have this exact thing built, the game now often lets you pay prestige or piety instead. That's a really nice change because it gives players more freedom in how they approach things. Maybe you don't want to wait ages to get the right building constructed, or maybe your circumstances make it impractical. Now you can just pay with resources you've been stacking up and still move forward. It makes oaths feel less restrictive and more like roleplay choices, which I think is the right direction. There's also been a small but very cool adjustment to how zealous characters interact with witchcraft. Before, trying to convert a zealous character to witchcraft was nearly impossible unless you got super lucky. Now, if their faith actually allows witchcraft, they're a lot more open to it. This makes a ton of sense. If your religion already has a framework where witchcraft isn't inherently evil, why would your zealous character resist so much? It was immersion breaking, and this change fixes that. It opens up a lot of fun roleplay opportunities because now you can actually spread witchcraft through faiths where it makes sense without banging your head against the wall. Here's one that I think is going to be talked about for a while, the divine marriage tenet. With this update, incestuous relationships under divine marriage are now seen as virtuous rather than sinful. That's definitely going to spice things up for certain playthroughs. Divine marriage was already a wild tenet, and now it's even more integrated into the roleplay side of things. If you've ever done a run where your dynasty embraces divine marriage, you know how quickly things can spiral. Now, those traits are actually considered positive within that framework, which makes it a much smoother and more logical mechanic. It also means that you're not constantly fighting against traits that your religion supposedly encourages. Again, it's one of those changes where it might sound small, but it really changes the flavor of an entire playstyle. And for the nomadic or step players out there, the level 6 millet storage yurt building has had its cost adjusted. Previously, it was too low compared to what it should have been, so people were getting a little too much of an advantage there. That's been brought up to the intended cost, so it's more balanced now. This is one of those fixes that mostly matters to hardcore players who push their economies to the max, but it's important for the long-term balance of the game. Something else that's brand new and pretty exciting. Coronation hosts now have an event where if you've got a skilled chancellor, you can try to break up a neighboring confederation or even snag a new vassal or tributary. That adds a bit more political flavor to coronations and makes them feel more than just a boxed ticking ceremony. It's a chance to actually expand your influence right there in the middle of your big event. I love this because coronations should feel like a moment where your ruler's legitimacy and power are on full display, and being able to leverage that into real political gains just makes sense. While we're still on coronations, the frequency of the witness event has been toned down. If you've been through multiple coronations, you probably saw this event pop up over and over again, to the point where it got repetitive. Now it shows up less often, so coronations will feel a little fresher each time you go through them. And on the smaller polished side, they've added more relation reasons for lovers in certain coronation events, which makes those interactions more believable and personal. Beyond coronations and oaths, there are lots of general fixes sprinkled throughout. Things like culture scoping and events being corrected, so the game actually recognizes what culture is relevant to the situation. Artifact interactions no longer get blocked by random unrelated activities, which was another frustrating thing when it happened. Inheritance laws resetting when heirs took over has also been fixed, which was a really nasty bug because it could wreck your succession plans without warning. And then, of course, there are the usual tweaks to tooltips, missing text, and little immersion details like that. All these fixes together create this effect where the game just feels smoother and more consistent. You don't necessarily notice each individual change in the middle of playing, but what you do notice is that fewer weird things are happening to break the flow of your story. And that's honestly one of the best kinds of updates in a game like Crusader Kings 3. Now, let's talk about the bigger picture for a second. Whenever Paradox drops these smaller patches, people sometimes shrug and say, well, it's just bug fixes. But I actually think updates like 1.7.1 are essential because Crusader Kings isn't just about mechanics, it's about immersion. It's a story generator, and the more polished those stories feel, the more satisfying your campaigns are. If coronations feel immersive, if oaths work the way they're supposed to, if tooltips actually explain what's going on, then your roleplay feels natural. You're not constantly fighting the system or second guessing whether something's bugged. And in a game this complex, that's huge. Personally, I think the changes to oaths are some of the most impactful here. They've gone from him being kind of confusing and buggy to actually working as clear roleplay promises. And with the added flexibility of paying costs instead of being locked into buildings, you can tailor them to your situation.